Now, one other situation where we don't get the expected Mendelian phenotypic outcomes that we think we should is when something called imprinting occurs, genetic imprinting. And this is pretty rare, and it's similar to what we talked about with lionization of the X chromosome, in that what happens is that a gene, some genes, if we get 2 copies of those genes, potentially are problematic, potentially lethal or cause other problems. So those genes then, one or the other, will be hypercoiled. And if it's hypercoiled, then it can't be transcribed and translated, and that's known as imprinting. So the hypercoiling of an allele is known as imprinting because that inactivates that particular gene or that particular allele. So what's also kind of interesting about these few cases of imprinting that have been discovered is that they tend to follow a paternal line or a maternal line. So let's look at some examples here, and hopefully it'll sort itself out for you. So again, if we're looking at a homologous pair of chromosomes, so saying that you've been inherited a homologous pair of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad potentially here. In imprinting, what's happening again is that hypercoiling of an allele is going to occur. So this would be a non-functional allele, this would be a functional allele. And so it doesn't really matter whether it's dominant or recessive. That really doesn't have anything to do with imprinting. It just has to do with who it was inherited from. Was it inherited from mom or was it inherited from dad in these maternal and paternal imprints? Now what I should also emphasize again also is this imprint would be on autosomes, not on the sex chromosomes. It would be on non-sex chromosomes. So let's look at an example of paternal imprinting and see what I mean by this. So in a paternal imprint, the inactive allele comes from dad. So in this case, dad has inherited an inactive allele from his dad, or a man has inherited an inactive allele from his dad, and then also inherited the homologous chromosome and an active allele from mom. Now, those then, remember when we have a homologous pair of chromosomes, we'll put one or the other into our gametes potentially. And so when the male puts his dad's chromosome in a gamete, it will still be imprinted. And when he takes the active chromosome or active allele that inherited from mom, when that's packaged in a sperm, the allele will be hypercoiled. It will be inactivated. So again, the imprint is inserted or applied by the father. So regardless of what chromosomes he has, even though he has an active chromosome here, when he packages them in his sperm, they will be inactivated. So whatever alleles he's inherited, the alleles he passes on in a paternal imprint will be inactive, regardless of whether they were dominant or recessive. Now, in a paternal imprint, if you were a female, you would have inherited the imprinted gene from dad and the non-imprinted gene from mom. And when you make your ova, you will take dad's chromosome and activate it again. You will take out the hypercoil, and of course this one is already active. So in a paternal imprint, again, the imprint is only placed or applied in the paternal lineage. The mom will actually remove the imprint when she makes her ova. So she will uncoil the imprinted alleles. So she will be passing on active genes or active alleles, whereas dad is passing on inactive alleles. So when those come together in the offspring then, there will be one active allele and one inactive allele. So let's go ahead and look then at the genotypes and the phenotypes that would result from that. So if you haven't noticed, what I'm doing with the red is indicating the inactive chromosome or inactive allele from that. In this case, if it's a paternal imprint, that would be coming from dad. So let's say you're an individual that's homozygous dominant. You got one from dad, one from mom. The inactive one is from dad, active one is from mom. In this case, the dominant allele will show itself. So you'd have the dominant phenotype, whatever it happens to be. So in this case, maybe you have a big A on your forehead. Okay, now, again, if you're homozygous for A and we switched the inheritance, one from mom, one from dad, you still have one active dominant allele, so you're going to have the dominant phenotype. Now, where it gets interesting is what if you're heterozygous? So in this situation, you've inherited a dominant allele from dad, but it's an imprinted allele, so it's an inactive allele. The non-imprinted allele came from mom, so even though you're heterozygous, and even though in normal Mendelian inheritance you should show the dominant phenotype, because the dominant allele is inactive, you will show the recessive phenotype. And if you're heterozygous and the dominant allele came from mom, which is already active, it wouldn't really matter. You would still show the dominant phenotype. So that would be normal inheritance here. So this is the one that's really the wild card. And then if you're homozygous recessive, even though one is inactivated, one will be active. So you'll show the recessive phenotype in either of these situations. So again, that would be a paternal imprint. When dad makes sperm, he inactivates whichever allele he passes on, whereas mom will make sure that those alleles are active. She removes the imprint. Now, let's compare that to a maternal imprint. So a maternal imprint is just the opposite. In this situation, mom will be the one imposing the imprint. She'll be doing the hypercoiling of a gene, whereas dad will not. So again, in this case, the woman has inherited an active chromosome from dad and an inactive one from her mom. And when she makes her ova, she will impose the imprint. Both of those chromosomes will be hypercoiled at that allele in her ova. Again, if it's a maternal imprint and you were a male, you'll do just the opposite. So you inherit from dad and from mom. And when you make your sperm, you will remove the imprints here. And so, again, when we look at our genotypes and phenotypes then, so again, the inactive form being inherited, in this case, from mom, active form from dad. If you're homozygous dominant, you'll have a dominant allele and you'll have the dominant phenotype. And again, it doesn't matter which parent it comes from, you'll have at least one dominant allele and it will show itself. And again, it gets interesting because if you get in heterozygotes, if you get the inactivated allele from mom in this case, it won't show itself. And so you'll show the recessive phenotype instead of the dominant phenotype, whereas this would be normal inheritance. And again, as long as you have one recessive active, you will show the recessive phenotype. So again, the weirdities come with the heterozygotes, where an inactive allele is inherited. It's the dominant allele, but it's inactive, so you show the recessive phenotype as a result. So imprinting's pretty bizarre, and again, it deals with one gene and flows through either a maternal lineage or a paternal lineage.